So hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this event. If you could sound off in the chat to just let us know that the broadcast is happening and live, that's always reassuring. And also we like to hear from you. So hi. Oh, hi, Shuchi. Shuchi is here. Okay. So hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Alexandra, and I am a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith, located in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is the first time you're hearing us, welcome in general. We're very happy to have all of you join our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of the authors and independent bookstores for your purchases and attendance. The chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. At this point, we're all pretty used to Zoom, so I assume you know how those work, but if you have any questions, I'll be in the chat the whole time to help you out. And please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event partaking in such behavior. But I have a feeling you are all wonderful, lovely people, and that would not be a problem. Mm-hmm. All right, so without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce our authors tonight. I'm just going to go side to side. So first we have Kim Adrian, who is the author of the memoir, The 27th Letter of the Alphabet. Her first book, Sock, is part of Bloomsbury's Object Lesson series. She edited the Shell Game Writers Play with Borrowed Forms, an anthology praised by the millions for offering a sense of hope about literature and its capacity for change. And tonight, Kim is here to discuss Dear Knausgaard, a series of warm and often funny letters by essayist and memoirist Kim Adrian, as I just said. It is a compelling feminist critique of the 6-volume autobiographical novel My Struggle by Norwegian writer Karl Ove Knausgaard. Adrian's book of letters begins as a witty and entertaining response to a seminal work and transforms into a fierce and powerful interrogation of the darker social and cultural forces informing Knausgaard's project. Through an examination of the curious operations of intimacy demanded on both sides of the page by all great literature, Dear Knausgaard ultimately provides a heartfelt celebration of the act of reading itself. And Kim is joined today by Alden Jones, who's the author of Unaccompanied Minors and The Blind Masseuse. Her stories and essays have appeared in the Best American Travel Writing, New York Magazine, Agni, The Rumpus, and others. She teaches creative writing and cultural studies at Emerson College and is core faculty in the low residency Newport MFA program at Salve Regina. Alden is here today to discuss The Wanting Was a Wilderness, which is a memoir in which Alden Jones set out to explore what propelled Cheryl Strand's Wild so effectively into the hearts of millions of readers. When that work was interrupted by a personal crisis, the project itself became a moment of self-discovery, of confronting the self, and of the unknown. The result is a profoundly original work that blends criticism, craft analysis, and a memoir of Jones's own time in the wilderness. It is a pleasure to have them both with us tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kim Adrian and Alden Jones.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Kim.
Yeah, I think the plan is I'm going to read first, and then Alden will read, and then we'll have a little discussion, and then we'll open things up for audience questions. So my book, as you just heard, is a series of letters to Karl Ove Knausgaard, is how I say his name. It's not the right way, but it's how I say it. And I'm going to read from towards the middle of the book, a letter dated July 6, 2019. Dear Knausgaard, it's insanely hot here today. The park next door is silent. Even the birds are eerily quiet. This makes for an interesting counterpoint to the book I'm reading, Bernadette Meyer's Midwinter Day, a book-length poem about a single day, December 22nd, 1978, in the life of the mother and poet named Bernadette Meyer. Meyer herself describes it as a desirous essay on art and home. Given that, I'm sure you won't find it surprising that Midwinter Day often reminds me of my struggle, in particular the way Meyer moves through the tasks of parenthood, dressing her daughters, taking them to the library, changing their diapers, shopping for groceries, trundling them home again, while simultaneously grappling with thoughts on art, the history and production of poetry, and the true purpose of reading and writing. This nonstop stream of thought is studded with, pierced by, the solidity of life, taking off the little one's winter coat, opening a wedge of cheese, drinking half a beer with a friend, getting the dumb objects out of the bag, and dealing with the awful sink. The thoughts flow around all of these actions and objects like a river in which Meyer wades, sometimes up to her neck, even as she helps her children over the icy streets of Lenox, Massachusetts, reads them The Three Little Pigs and Big Dog, Little Dog, and The Tiny Tawny Kitten, or guides them up the stairs in their clunky winter boots. It's super beautiful. It was my sister-in-law, Julie, who turned me on to Meyer. Julie is a poet. She and I have a lot in common. I mean, beyond the fact that we're both mothers and writers. For instance, we both like to knit and to bake and to garden. Actually, it's for these very reasons, and a few others, that we've been over the years fervidly, if furtively, competitive with one another. But as we've gotten older, we've both managed somehow to mellow, and now we're friends again, the way we were back in college when we used to take writing workshops and dance classes together, before I started dating James. Julie teaches at the University of Colorado, so we don't get to see each other that often. But the last time she visited Boston, she and I had an interesting conversation about my struggle. It started with a question. Why had I chosen to write about it? I noticed a dubious expression on her face as she asked this. It made me wonder if she didn't like my struggle, because as I'm sure you've noticed, a lot of people don't, simply as a matter of course, on principle, even if they haven't read it. I suspect it's the covers. It could also be the title, or just the way it sounds in summary. In any case, Julie told me that she actually had read book 1 and the first half of book 2 as well, and that while she appreciated the writing, especially those passages that describe the physical operations of raising young children, she'd had to put it down when she got fed up with hearing you complain about how hard it is to be a father while also trying to write. Here she made another literally meant, try being a woman. She got especially fed up, she said, of you acting as if you were doing your wife a huge favor every time you watched the kids. I tried to defend you, I mean the you of your novel, by explaining that Linda is mentally ill, and as a result you, that is Karlove, wind up doing the lion's share of the housework and perhaps more than your fair share of the childcare as well. Julie said, She hadn't realized this, which is reasonable as you don't make it clear until very late in the game, not explicitly. We were eating pre-dinner appetizers in my in-laws' kitchen as we spoke, Julie every once in a while popping a wasabi pea into her mouth, while I made steady progress on a wedge of melting brie. Eventually, it seemed inevitable, we got onto the question of whether or not my struggle would have been greeted by the same fanfare had it been written by a woman. This is a much debated point, as I'm sure you know, although it's never made a lot of sense to me. I mean, how could a woman have written my struggle when you wrote my struggle? I just don't understand the exercise of conjuring, as Katie Roiphe did in her essay, Her Struggle, a Carla Olivia Krauss, in order to try to imagine how critics and readers might have responded to an equally gigantic novel penned by a female doppelganger, a novel treating all the same things you treat in yours, the beauty and tedium of raising young children, the trials of intimacy and marriage, the haunting torment of a psychologically abusive parent, the textures of daily life, and, of course, the passion, vanity, and spiritual pressure that underlie all serious literary endeavor. It makes no sense, I said. Every word of my struggle is sifted through Knausgaard's sensibility, which acts like a filter. This filter is really the entire point of the whole thing. The specificity of one individual's individual experience, the power of the particular, the precisely this, here, now, the reality of a singular local perspective. Yeah, maybe, said Julie. But I think the more important point is that a woman wouldn't have gotten the same accolades for a similar book because a woman wouldn't have written a book like that in the first place. A woman wouldn't dare. What do you mean? A woman would never take up that much room. What about Miss Mackintosh, my darling, or Ferrante? I mean, she wouldn't take up that much room and devote it entirely to her own experience. It's inconceivable. We're trained out of egoism to such a degree and from such an early age, I don't even think it would be mentally possible. But it's true, if a woman did manage to write something like that, it wouldn't in a million years get the same reception. It would just be considered repulsive, not heroic. This is such an interesting thought, one that stayed with me. What is it exactly that makes my struggle heroic? Because as much as you may resist the notion, or at least pretend to resist it, when all is said and done, it is a hero's journey. And although I suspect you'd balk at the idea, if only for decorum's sake, you yourself, I'm talking about both of you, author and character, actually are heroic. Even long before the fame kicked in, you were larger than life, smarter, more articulate, better read, simply more capable on several fronts than your average Joe. And then you dug down as deeply as you could to reveal your thoughts and feelings, not as they ought to be, but as they really were. And this exercise laid you and those around you quite bare. In this state, you sought contact with something we all know, but for some reason fear. I think of it as a kind of filament running through everything, a kind of energy or electricity. And it's this that really makes you extraordinary, because not many people can do that, touch that. Some can, not many. Bernadette Meyer can do it and did do it in Midwinter Day. But that book is not a hero's journey. It's a sly, beautiful reckoning. What accounts for the difference? Is it simply a matter of scope, of page count? Does the physical enormity of your project make it by default an epic, while the brevity of Meyer's renders her a lyric? Maybe. Or is Julie right that only a man could successfully have written about these issues at such incredible length? If so, what does that mean? I mean, what does that really mean? And if not, if the mythical creature called Carla Olivia Krauss somehow did manage to buck all the social conventions you bucked, though skewed, of course, to accommodate the constraints inherent in being a woman rather than a man, and was able to write with as much raw, rushed beauty as you did for a few thousand pages, would Julie still be right? Would Krauss's efforts even then be considered, by and large, repulsive rather than heroic? Yes, it's a muddy realm of inquiry, all those hypotheticals, but it's precisely the hypotheticals that make the answer so obvious. Kim, Adrian.
I have so many questions for you, Kim, and opinions about Knausgaard.
Okay.
And I can't wait to ask those of you after this reading. So I'm reading from The Wanting Was a Wilderness, which is in the same series as Dear Knausgaard. And I took this project as a sort of a puzzle to solve. So Cheryl Strayed had written this incredibly easy to connect with, powerful memoir that so many people loved. And I wanted to understand how she did it, partially because I write memoir, but partially because I had gone on a similar journey. So I start to break down some of the craft elements that Cheryl Strayed used. And then I start within the text building my own memoir of my time in the wilderness. So I'm going to read really briefly from the end of a section where I'm talking about persona and how Cheryl Strayed creates this persona for the Cheryl who appears in Wild, and then move into the personal side of my story. Many readers I have talked to said the experience of reading Wild is similar to a conversation with a good friend. How are so many varied personalities able to access a similar intimacy with the same persona? It has to do with that tractor beam of inner truth, the self-knowledge and the ability to be clear and forthcoming about it, and what author Steve Almond, the original Sugar and a friend of Strayed's, dubbed the radical empathy that emerges from this self-knowledge. The tone of authenticity and self-awareness makes it feel she is being real with you, and that you, in turn, can be real with her, and more importantly, with yourself. Almond adds, we need books, and Cheryl's books in particular, because we are all, in the private kingdom of our hearts, desperate for the company of a wise, true friend. Someone who isn't embarrassed by our emotions, or her own, who recognizes that life is short and that all we have to offer, in the end, is love. The Cheryl we are introduced to in Wild is the daughter of a beloved mother who had scrambled to make a good life for her children and was diagnosed with aggressive lung cancer at age 45. She is a daughter intensely devoted to her mother, who chose to fold her life down when she learned of her mother's cancer diagnosis. Her life became unmoored by sorrow after she arrived at the hospital just weeks after the diagnosis, to absorb the shock of her mother's death. Instead of arriving to see her alive as she expected, Cheryl is greeted by the sight of ice packs perched on her dead mother's eyelids. She is grief-stricken, scooped out, feral. From the outset of this hiking story, Cheryl is not claiming any of the go-to identities of the expert or gearhead or outdoor adventure boundary pusher. As grieving daughter, she leans into her grief, and then she sets out to accomplish something very difficult to help her climb out of her grief, all while being unextraordinary. At the bottom of it, she is a normal person, like you. And if you ever suffered a great loss, she's even more like you. My own systematic oppression. I, too, was once a normal person in the wilderness, though being not a wilderness person is not a precise filter through which to tell the story of my time in the woods. My persona needs a mission that will drive her towards her story. But entering the wilderness physically, and as you will soon see, psychologically unprepared, is a place to start. I'll place you in the early part of the physical journey where conflict is clear. But then I will have to go further into the past to locate a deeper conflict that sprouted earlier. In September 1992, 3 years before Cheryl hiked the PCT, I arrived in the Asheville, North Carolina airport, carrying a duffel bag filled with gear similar to what strayed scattered across her room at White's Motel. Like Cheryl, I was the opposite of an expert or guide. I was technically an adult and also technically a teenager. There were a lot of things I did not know. I'd never heard of polypropylene. I'd never used the blade of my Swiss Army knife for anything other than cutting slices off a block of cheese at a picnic. As a kid, I'd attended summer camp in North Carolina, where I'd learned to canoe and puncture targets with arrows and jump semi-bravely into a lake crawling with tadpoles. But I'd felt like a misfit there with my Yankee accent and bewildered as to why my parents hadn't sent me to performing arts camp in New England with the other New York City area kids. I was a bookish type who preferred the indoors. I had never been stung by a bee. I was hopeless at team sports. I assumed rain signified the cancellation of any outdoor plans. After growing up in the New Jersey suburbs with a distinct impression that life was more sophisticated elsewhere, I was firmly urban identified. I had completed 2 years of college in Providence and arrived on the edge of the Appalachian Trail after a summer in Manhattan. My physical exercise prior to this trip consisted of dancing at clubs and walking between my apartment in Chelsea and my office job in Soho. I considered the Doc Marten combat boots I wore most days the equivalent of athletic footwear. I was in Asheville to begin a three-month expedition with the Wilderness School of all wilderness schools, Outward Bound. The decision to join this expedition had happened suddenly. I was halfway through college and experiencing a crisis far less acute than Strade's. I couldn't name it, but something wasn't happening in my life that was supposed to be happening. I'd expected by now I'd feel more like an adult who had conquered some of the childish insecurities I still felt stuck with. I had this notion that I could improve my person in some unidentifiable way. This is where the persona of my wilderness memoir grows murky. There was no inciting incident that sent me to the woods, no external crisis. I was defined by a vague confusion, an identity question mark. I was seeking illumination of some kind, but how can I illuminate a reader via my own blurry lens? 2 pieces of my identity present themselves now, with the self-knowledge acquired over more than 2 decades, as important at the time: my sexual identity and my academic life. I've already let you know, through details of my urban orientation and my nonchalance about outdoor activities, that I was not on a quest that had anything to do with the wilderness specifically. Somehow, these 2 pieces of my identity, which were linked, punted me off my trajectory of college in 4 years and carried me voluntarily into the landscape where I didn't belong. To understand how and why, I will have to search the scenes, fashion the beads for my necklace, the pieces of my history. I will have to mind the memories. I'm going to have to write them down to figure out which ones matter. I'll stop there. So, Kim, I am going to admit that I am one of those people who's never read Knausgaard and have kind of one of those similar opinions of like, I don't know, like, how is he allowed to do that? Like, write about himself for that many books? And you seem very conflicted about it too in the text. So I see a lot of conflict in terms of like, you love some of the books, you hate, you find some of them boring. I don't want to use the word hate, but you find some of them kind of like drudgery to read, you describe it. And did you know, like when you started out, what you wanted to say about the books, or were you writing to figure it out? And was that conflict and in any way resolved by the end?
I think I had some areas of inquiry that I was definitely intrigued by. I wasn't ever put off by the, what you just said, like talking about himself for that long, because I think that when you start reading him, you realize he's talking about other things really underneath that. But I definitely was conflicted about other things. I mean, the biggest one that I tackle in this book is his the way he creates up this really intense duality between the masculine and the feminine. And that led me to questions about how different it is to operate as someone like Knausgaard, someone who's white and middle class and male, how the fabric of society and the fabric of the literary canon supports work from someone like that in a way that's different than it would do for another kind of person.
Yeah, I thought about Elizabeth Wurtzel. Like, she didn't write as much as Knausgaard, but she wrote a lot about herself, and the reception was generally like, "Oh, she's so self-indulgent," right? Like, that's a gendered opinion, I think. Yeah.
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 Well, people definitely accuse him of being self-indulgent. I mean, he gets that, but he also gets lionized for this massive work that's focused a lot on the domestic, which is generally traditionally the female realm. So why does all of a sudden this male writer get lionized for doing something that women have been doing for as long as they've been kind of able to write? It's a big question.
So you mentioned this in the text, and I'm just going to ask you a bunch of questions at once. Is that okay?
Okay.
Okay. I think it might be easier than trying to go back and forth between the books.
Okay.
So you mentioned in the text, like you considered like, what it would be like for him to actually read these letters, because you say, these are letters to you, but they're also kind of not. They're chapters in a book. So what kinds of feelings do you have about like, what if he actually read these letters that are addressed to him, but sort of written for him and sort of written for a different intended audience?
I make this distinction in the book that there's Karlove Knausgaard, like the person who's walking around the planet Earth somewhere, this writer, and there's what I call Coke, like his initials in my mind, who's this imaginary friend. Like, Coke is my buddy. Coke loves these letters. He thinks they're really funny. He thinks I'm very insightful. He gets me. And I really do have a friendly, even before I started writing the letters, I had this feeling of affection for this imaginary construct that I think is actually really separate from the person I've never met. I've seen him at a couple of readings, but when I think about the real person reading this book, I do get anxious.
What makes you anxious?
What if I offend him? What if he doesn't think I'm a good writer? Like, all these questions that I can't really bear to think about. So I try not to think about that. I stick with Coke.
So you were really immersed in his writing. Do you feel like when you were reading so much of his work, did you feel like when you started to write about it, did his style influence you in the way that you wrote your book or your letters?
No, I mean, I think I've had that experience of being influenced by another writer's voice, but I think like I've had really vivid experiences of reading Thomas Bernhard and then like trying to write and feeling like I'm channeling a really cheap version of Thomas Bernhard. It's a disaster. But I think that my own style, like long before I read any Knausgaard, has some areas of overlap with his. So like I've always been really interested in sensory detail and sort of tactile impressions and minutia and like everyday, small, ordinary, everyday moments. That's been something that's like I've written about, that's been subject matter for me for a long time. So that might be a big part of why I'm so attracted to Knausgaard's work. But I did start to realize as I was writing these letters that somebody who doesn't know my work might think that I was kind of copying his style because there is this overlap. There is one spot where I purposely do set out to kind of copy his attention to, he's famous for like really focused attention on minute details and kind of creating this incredible texture of the world around him that feels very immersive. And I think it actually like sets off brain activity that feels like you're actually in that same environment because the descriptions are so great. So there's one place where I do that on purpose. But I didn't have that feeling of his style seeping into mine. But I wonder if you did. I mean, just to kind of mix up this conversation a little bit, I have the same question for you.
Yeah, I think I was very conscious of it, of, you know, am I sort of going for a similar style that, you know, in which Cheryl Strayed was writing, or am I going for something different? And, you know, of course, I wanted to make this book appealing both to someone who had read Wilde and also to someone who hadn't read Wilde. So I did think about the reader of Wilde when I was writing this, and I was like, I don't want it to be so different in any like major, you know, stylistic way that it would feel alienating to someone who loved Wilde, and then they came to this and were like, oh, this is like not a continuation of the story for me. So I wanted to offer that to readers, but I also one of the things I really love about Cheryl Strayed's work is how incredibly direct her language is. Like someone asked me, like, you know, did you like absolutely love Wilde and that's why you wanted to write about it? And I love Wilde, but it's much more like it's not the same kind of love I have for like the work that I can't really understand, right? Like how did Toni Morrison do that? You know, I don't really know. It's not the same kind of like awe of the language as much as it is the incredible crystalline ability to express emotion that I think so many people were like, oh, you're telling me, you're explaining something that I feel, but I have never been able to put into words. And so I did want to sort of write in a clear style as well. But I definitely also wanted my book to be a standalone. Like I wanted it to be like have my style, obviously. And yeah, I mean, I think I thought about it, but it was more in a structure way than a style way. So less about the sentences, more about the, you know, how did she use time? You know, how did she break the chronology to keep you interested? Maybe I'll try that right now. So that was more how I was mimicking.
Right. So for those of you who haven't read Alden's book, it's a really interesting kind of braided construction. It's, as I see it, it has three elements. One would be the analysis of Cheryl Strayed's Wilde, and also a kind of similar mini memoir about Alden's time as a college student going on an outward bound trip. So another hiking memoir. But then kind of pulling them both together is this third element, which is this very creative way of constructing and almost like a how to write a memoir advice for memoirists, aspiring memoirists. And I guess I just wonder how, like, first of all, how did you arrive at that very unusual triad? And how did you do pull it off beautifully. It's kind of an amazing thing in such a tiny book that you get so much going. But what gave you the, like, how did you think you could do that? You did it, but
who do I think I am? And yeah, I think that speaks to the, like, how our books came about. I actually I don't think it's a great idea to write a book this way, like not knowing what you're going to do with it until you are in the middle of it. But that's how I did this one. I was like, okay, I'm going to start. I know I'm going to write about, certain elements of Cheryl Strayed's Wild. I'm going to write about what it means to be a woman alone, hiking in the wilderness. And I'm going to write about, the body and all these things, themes that came into Wild that also were thematically important to my story. And then I'm going to tell my story, but this back and forth is like not going to be interesting enough to maintain a whole book. So I have to figure out how to make it, like one of the things I talk about in terms of what makes a successful memoir is there's the situation. So there's like, the plot or what's happening. And then there's a story, which is, Vivian Gornick's, designation that all memoir writers know, what it means, like what it's about or what the real point is. I was like, okay, the situation for me is I'm comparing, or I'm analyzing this book and using my experience somehow to draw some meaning from it, but what's the story? So I had to figure out, like, what am I really trying to say that's beyond, here's some interesting, critical insights into this book. And so I realized what I was so in awe of with the book was, in addition to her ability to just express emotion so clearly, was just this way she touched such a universal nerve. Like, how has she done that? And it was, like, I have been on hiking trips. I had this really intense experience, but I couldn't have really imagined it being that interesting to other people because it's walking, it's just, you're walking and it's so intense for you, but it's like, and then there was this really big slope and it was really, then I got poison ivy and it was itchy and it's like, it doesn't really impact a reader that much, but she'd done it, right, by weaving in this history and giving us this insight into her life before. So I realized what I was writing, or what the story was how to write a memoir, like how to write a memoir well. So I really didn't know how I was going to bring it all together by the end. And I know there's at least one person in the audience who has listened to me talk a lot about like, maybe I should do this and maybe I can do that. And I kind of got to almost the end and was like, all right, I gotta step away from this, and gave myself enough time to figure it out in my head before I realized how I could bring it all together. But I'm glad you think it works, Kim. Thank you.
I think it works great.
Thank you.
It leads me to another question, though, which, like, as someone who's written memoir, and I'm really interested in this relationship, but it seems like every time you hit a stumbling block in this book, you talk about it, you tell the reader, like, I'm stuck. And every time you get past it, it's by, like, whatever you called, you were describing Strayed's work, but like the laser beam of truth, like you found the thing that mattered, and the most honest way into it. And I guess, yeah. And that's like something that I feel like, is really true in Knausgaard's work too. And I guess I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about the relationship between, like, really deep honesty, like uncomfortable honesty, actually, like that you wouldn't necessarily reveal in your day-to-day contacts.
Yeah.
And memoir.
Which is definitely applicable to your book as well. Like, first of all, your thoughts about the book, but also, like, you kind of take Knausgaard to task, like, maybe some of these should have been inside thoughts, Knausgaard, like when you, like, your sort of uncensored opinions can be hurtful to some people. So I'd love to hear you talk about that too. Yeah, so I think I really, especially when I had my life crisis in the middle of the book, was like, the problem that I'm having with continuing to write this book is that there's something in my life that's in the way of an authentic life. There's something happening in my world that isn't allowing me to live most authentically. So I took and an entire 2 years off from writing the book, fixed my life, with a lot of mess in, the making of the fixing. And then I felt like very driven by this idea of being true and authentic in the writing. And it was kind of fun to be like, oh, I realized what I could do is, make myself seem like a better person by leaving out these details, but I'm going to put them in, and then I'm going to explain to you why I kept them in. Or I could make very neatly end the story with a message that made me, seem kind of resolved at the end of the wilderness expedition, but I wasn't really. So how can I come to a true resolution? So that's when it got kind of unruly, and I had to tame it. But tell us a little bit about how your book came about in the first place, and how you chose this incredible tome to work with, and what you saw as your goal with the book.
I think, well, I was just intrigued by the series. Both of our books belong to this Afterwards series put out by Fiction Advocate, which is this tiny little, punky little press that I really love.
I have a bunch of them right here. They're so cute.
They're really cute.
They look really good together.
And the way the publisher describes it is like reinventing literary criticism. And the whole idea is to bring a personal vantage point to literary criticism. So blending these two things. And Alden favors the term biblio-memoir for this. And I really like lyric criticism. Doesn't matter what you call it, but it's the same kind of thing.
And critical memoir comes up too.
Yeah. And so I was just into it, and I reached out to Brian, who's the editor at Fiction Advocate, and said I was interested, and I pitched doing something about Lydia Davis, actually, like who's the polar opposite of Knausgaard. Yeah. And that just didn't fit with the goals of the series. So he sent me a list of books that they'd already kind of thought would be great for it, and I'd read several of the books on it and didn't love any of them enough to write a whole book. I knew I'd have to really love something to write about it. And I was in the middle of reading My Struggle. And so I said, well, what about this? And Brian liked that idea. So I agreed to write this book before I'd actually finished writing My Struggle, which led to a few complications.
Did you know I'd never read Wild before I took this assignment?
Yeah. I remember you must mention that in the book. Or so somehow I knew that.
I didn't mention it in the book. I told Brian right after I handed it in. He was like, oh shit. What were your complications that you stumbled upon when you hadn't finished reading it?
The main complication was book 6, which is this thick, and this crazy book with this
Hitler thing.
Yeah, it has a famously difficult 400-page essay about Hitler's Mein Kampf and World War II and the Nazis, and a lot of things become clear, like Knausgaard's kind of underlying philosophical intentions, which I don't think were all set out in the beginning, but they were guiding him organically throughout the composition of the previous 5 books. They suddenly become really clear in book 6, and it was just I think I was in the middle of book 5 when I said I'd write my book, and thought I had a handle on things. And then, this 1,200-page monster gets translated into English, and it's really hard to read it because it's just exhausting. And that essay is very difficult. And it just meant that I had to rethink everything about My Struggle. And so that was that was the stumbling block. Yeah.
Would you recommend Knausgaard?
Wholeheartedly. Yeah. I mean, I know that I say things in there that sound maybe like I'm saying, maybe this
is he for a specific kind of reader, or is it a recommendation that you would make to a general reader?
A general reader, maybe not. I think you have to be interested in deep dives and in literature, someone who's interested in serious literature, which I think is a different kind of reader than someone who wants an escape, although I do think that he offers that. Like it kind of seems, I've never read Wild either, but seems like Wild offers kind of an adventure story on top of everything else.
Mhm.
And Knausgaard doesn't offer that, but this addictive quality of the detail is something that, I mean, people get super hooked on it. And it goes, even though it's so huge, it goes really fast, except for book 6.
I have book 1 on the shelf, back there on the shelf, but
Yeah.
I haven't read it yet, but I think I might now that I've read your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's beautiful. The end of book 1 is just, it's just so one of my favorite pieces of writing ever. It's a real tour de force, I think. So I wanted to ask you, you're going to meet Cheryl Strayed and do an event with her.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of wanted to turn that question back to you. Like, you actually have the opportunity to meet this person that you've been thinking about her work for a long time. And
Mm-hmm.
does that feel like a weird schism in the space-time continuum, or not?
Well, you had mentioned before, you're the differentiation between like the Knausgaard who's in the book, who you feel very friendly with, and the author, who's someone you don't know. And I think it is with Cheryl Strayed, they're so close. Like the person she is in Wild, the person she is not on the page, as far as I have come to understand, are so close that it is really hard for me not to feel like I don't already know her, especially having spent so much time with this book and her other essays. But I actually have met her before, and she actually had been on the committee of an award that one of my books was a finalist for, a Penn Award. And so I like kind of marched up to her at AWP and was like, hi. And she had no idea who I was, and she was like, hi. And just totally warm and friendly. And I was like, so I wrote this book, The Blind Masseuse, and, it was this thing that you were on the jury for. And she was like, oh yeah, that Costa Rica book. Yeah, I remember that. So we'd had that connection. And then I was like, now I'm writing a book about your book. And he was like, oh, you're writing a book about my book? And then she just gave me your email address. And she was,
Wow.
She was very gracious, and she is an extremely busy person, and, answered some of my questions that went into the book. So I'm very excited. I haven't talked to her about the book. I don't know how she feels about the analysis, but I am going to find out on Wednesday. So I'm thrilled. She said yes when the Center for Fiction suggested the event.
Yeah, it's awesome. That's great.
So yeah. Should we turn it over? Is it time to turn it over?
Do we have any questions
Or
from the audience? I don't know if Alexandra was. Hi.
Hey. Hello. Okay. That took a second. Yeah, it doesn't look like we have any audience questions currently, but it looks like Nina just sent one in the chat, so I'll read that to begin, and then if anybody, while we're going through that, if that sparks anything in anyone else, please feel free to go ahead and ask as many questions as you'd like. So Nina says, there's an intimacy to being inside a book in this way. As you were both working on these books, was it a feeling of intimacy with the text, with the author, or both?
I think when it was, I wrote the first half of the book in one way, and then I wrote the second half of the book after the 2-year time period of not writing. And I felt almost like I was getting too intimate with the writer, or not with the writer, but the persona. Like I was sort of starting to assume I knew her better than she knew herself, kind of thing, as the critic kind of does that sometimes. And it didn't feel like, it didn't feel fair. It was like the critic gets to say whatever they want. Like the reader gets to say whatever they want. It's like sort of when you go on Amazon and you see all these ridiculous 1-star reviews of classic, works of literature. So I think in turning to a different exercise, like I'm not trying to explain everything about Wild, but I'm trying to illustrate how well she created a narrative, and also taking on that task myself, which is not easy. So it wasn't as much like, it was more like that became the springboard for this other very difficult task that made it seem like I was like I was on tracks, or like we were walking alongside each other more. So I felt less intimacy, like in this claustrophobic way, and more like bouncing ideas off the text or bouncing ideas off each other. What do you think, Kim?
I think that for me, this construction of this Coke figure, this imaginary buddy, who was really mostly, it's 90%, I would say, my reading of Karl Ove in my struggle, my reading of that character, which is, of course, based on Knausgaard's own life. That's the whole premise of that novel. But I felt like, my book, Alden, your book is interesting. I think there's this funny compare contrast, because your book is an analysis of another book, and then it's about writing. And my book is an analysis of a book, and it's about reading.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really important to me to honor my experience of reading. And when I read My Struggle, I really felt like very close, and like I knew this person on the page. But when I actually started picking that feeling apart and trying to write about it, I realized it really has nothing to do with an actual human being. It's this kind of mental, emotional experience that I had because of the act of reading. So I think the question is there an intimacy to being inside a book? I think ultimately it's a feeling of intimacy with the text, and kind of leaning on this idea of Coke as being separate from Knausgaard himself. Let me express that feeling of intimacy without like feeling like it was weird, or, like it let me really connect back to the text, I think, which is where the intimacy lives for me. And that's where it lives for readers. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I have a kind of a random question, because this just came up for me when I was looking for which passage I wanted to read. Are there any passages that you would like never read at a reading, or that you would never want to be on the internet in some way? Like, are there any like passages that just feel a little scary to have out there?
I know there are, because I had that same experience today. I was like, no, I'm not going to read that, but I can't remember what it was. I think, there's certain arguments that I'm developing, and it takes time to develop the arguments. You have very complex arguments that you're developing in The Wanting Was a Wilderness too. And it's like, if you just take a piece out, it's going to sound
it's hard to find an excerpt. Yeah. I remember being in P-Town and with my second book and being like, I'm so used to just going through and be like, oh, I can't read that. There are kids in the audience, can't read that. Like, there are people who might not like that. And I'm in P-Town. Oh my God, I can read anything. So the internet is a little more of a scary place to have things out there. But yeah, do you have any more, like, should we talk more about the Afterward series in general, or?
Are there any more questions?
I have a couple more questions.
Oh, okay.
But I would love to hear more about the series as well. So this one is from Alexandra, who asks, Kim, what made you think of writing the book in letters, and what freedoms or restrictions did it present?
So I agreed to write the book, I'm going to say in April of 2018, and immediately got kind of paralyzed because I was so cowed by the idea of criticizing this massive work of literature that I really admired, and that, people that were already saying was a classic and had already entered the literary canon. And it just felt like, oh my God, how am I going to critique this? This is just not, I can't do this. So I spent, I think it was close to a year kind of pecking away at it and flailing, deleting, walking away from it, doing other stuff, pretending it wasn't there, that I didn't really have to do it. And then finally, when push came to shove and I really did have to do it, I, out of desperation, I feel like this happens a lot with me. I just push myself into a really uncomfortable corner, and then something breaks open, and it was the letter format. And all it did was give me freedom. Like there really weren't limitations to it. It was just like, oh my God, thank God I figured that out, because then it became really, really fun. And, you know, I could just say everything that I'd wanted to say, and it made it so much more informal. And the pressure to be like a critic left, and in its place was, you know, the ability to be a reader who was thoughtful in a critical way, but it was really, I was just being a reader. Yeah.
And also ask him questions. Like you were like posing a lot of questions, like things you hadn't, you know, you're like, I'm not explaining this, but more wondering about it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. True. Yeah.
All right. And then this one is from an anonymous attendee who asks, how did each of you navigate the waters of voice, the voice of the critic, and then the lyric of the personal voice?
I think I was actually really worried about the critical voice being boring. Like I was like, how am I going to make a book review voice go that long without making you feel like, like it's not as enjoyable as, creative writing. So I actually was relieved that people didn't respond that way when I had my first readers who were, I think my biggest concern was like, how do I make the same voice work for the critical element, like how the critic's voice and then the memoirist voice. So there was definitely a lot of like, spackling as I figured out how to make them work together. But I think eventually it started to become very easy to move back and forth.
Mm. Can you read that question again, actually?
Absolutely.
I kind of forgot what it was too.
How did each of you navigate the waters of voice, the voice of the critic and the lyric of personal voice? So I think in sort of, that's a very beautifully worded question, but like
it is
sort of simpler terms, like how did you navigate the push and pull of like the critic and the memoir?
Yeah, I think for me, I think that I do that a lot. I've done it a lot. My writing does tend to have like critical or analytical elements in it already. There were a couple of places where I felt like I had to deliver a summary of this massive book, and that was a challenge. That felt a little artificial, but I knew I had to do it for readers who hadn't read my struggle. So there were a couple of places in the book where it felt like I was working hard to make this, necessary component feel organic to the more lyric voice. But for the most part, I think I've just, for a really long time, I've been writing with that combo of analytical and lyric. And that's actually why the letters were so fun, because it let me do that, which is my natural gig. So, yeah.
All right. And then this is from Shuchi, who asks, once you've decided you were going to write a book about a book, how did that alter the experience of reading the book?
Profoundly. Yeah. I think it was Yale Doctor who said like all readers should read books twice. All writers should read books twice, one for pleasure and twice for work. So definitely I hadn't read Wild before, so I didn't really get the pure pleasure read, but I was back in, I've been in, school basically since I was 5. Like I've always been like a school-minded person. So I always take notes of the margins and that kind of thing. So it felt a little more like I had a paper to do, I had an assignment to do. And so I was back in college, but I've always really enjoyed that, so it was enjoyable in a different way. So, yeah.
I don't get that distinction. Like, when I read for pleasure, I'm also reading. I know that people say there's like a way of reading for pleasure where you're not thinking about how something's constructed or whatever, but to me, that is the pleasure. So, I do that, and that's the fun part. And writing about my struggle felt like, it involved a lot of rereading and just getting to see, like, it's such a naturalistic voice and there's so much craft hidden in it, mostly because his voice is so incredibly sophisticated, even though it seems naive. But what he's doing with it and how it relates to his largest themes is kind of amazing. But anyway, it was just really fun to spend that much time with it and kind of think more deeply about how he swung this crazy magic trick. Yeah.
All right, so it just as kind of a final closing little, I'll say it's a question because I would like to know. Could you just tell me a little bit more about the series that you're both a part of, and what is it, what you're excited about, like what comes next, maybe, or like what people who are interested in your two books could maybe look forward to in the rest of the series.
We do know one that's coming next. I'm trying to remember.
Do we?
It's J.M. Tyree's book.
Oh, right.
And I'm trying to remember which book he wrote about.
Not something I read. I remember that.
I think it was Pinchin. Something Pinchin.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
So that I know that's next, but they published them in sets of 3. I was actually supposed to be in the first round of 3, and that was a few rounds back, and my book got pushed. And Brian was very understanding about my time, but I can show you some of the other ones. This is Bizarro World about Jonathan Liam's Fortress of Solitude by Stacy Williams, and you can see that here's Stephanie Reed's I Meant to Kill You about Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. The covers are kind of meant to look like the original text cover, to be like a Cool Customer by Jacob Bachrach about Joan Didion's Theory of Magical Thinking. And this one just came out with ours. This was the third in our series. Looking Was Not Enough. I hope I don't say her name incorrectly, by Irena Yambaliev, who is writing about Middlesex. So interesting. But yeah, I think it's an ongoing series. So if any writers in the audience are like dying to write about a book, they should think about it.
Yeah, definitely.
That's
It's fun. It's a fun project.
Yeah, I loved seeing all the covers just then, because they do kind of look like the original. That's amazing. Yeah. All right, well, we're definitely down to the last few minutes, so just I'd like to take this time to thank you both again so much for being here and for having
so much
this amazing conversation. And thank you to everyone in the audience as well for being here and for supporting the store. I dropped links to both books in case you haven't grabbed a copy yet. But yeah, so just thank you everyone. We've got more events coming up. Next week we've got just one event, I think, but in the rest of September we've got a pretty packed schedule. So if you'd like to see more, you can always visit us at brooklinebooksmith.com. And yeah, that's kind of it. So thank you all so much, and I hope everybody has a lovely night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.